I'm going to start by asking the panel to introduce themselves. Unfortunately, Sarah Winlow from AONB Northumberland Coast was unable to make it today discussing a landscape perspective, but we also have Daniel Spraggon from the Diocese of Durham and Maddie Maughan, who seems to be the woman of the day everywhere, a freelance creative producer, so who has worked on Festival of Thrift for many years. So each are going to do a quick 5-minute intro, and then we're going to open it up to panel discussion. So, thanks. Daniel, would you like to begin?
I will begin. Yes, can you hear me okay? Yes. Yeah, it's not on. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And can I just very quickly say, in terms of what I'm going to take away from today, I will be going to the tall ships. I'll be back up steel rig, investing in the cultural history of the war. And Jules, historic England, you really do improve people's lives. Okay, that's great. There you go. And the functional power of competence, was that's a takeaway phrase, and there's going to be none of that in the next 5 minutes. Okay, so to say, what I thought I could do, Lisa, is just basically say where the Diocese of Durham, what the challenges are that we're facing as an organisation in this context, where we sit in a sort of national framework, and why it's really relevant to everyone here. Can I just ask you a question? To the audience, if you put your hands up or shout out, which organisation in the country owns the most historic buildings, please say. Right, yeah, it is the Church of England. You were meant to say historic England, and I'd say no, and then you'd say, someone would put their hand up and say National Trust, and I'd say no. It is, you ready? It is the Church of England. All right, thank you. The Church of England has 16,000 buildings. 80% of those are listed. I understand that half of the Grade 1 buildings in the country are churches or cathedrals. That's just to put it into context. The National Synod of the Church of England has recently made a commitment that all church buildings will meet net zero carbon by 2030, and yeah. And it has a roadmap for parishes to follow. People like the brilliant Kate Boardman, vicar at the local Heart and St. Peter. Hi, Kate, you can give a wave. And there's a roadmap there to say how parishes will do that for their church buildings and their churchyards, going from A to D, A being the least intervention, the cheapest, and with the greatest payback. It gets a bit trickier after that. The Church of England has a body of the Church Buildings Council, and the rules have been changed. Faculty jurisdiction has been changed to make it harder for churches not to meet their commitments, and that might be, for example, by installing a gas or oil-fired boiler to replace their existing dying one. And the issue is that the Church Buildings Council, which is has church care, which in that, guys, is a brilliant resource, and you should check the Church Care web pages. The Church Buildings Council provides excellent administration and resources, but at a diocesan level, there are 42 dioceses in the country, and the Diocese of Durham covers 7 local authorities, from the Tyne down to the Tees, across to the Pennines. And in our diocese, we have 265 churches, and the diocese doesn't own any of them. They are effectively owned by the excellent people like Kate. They are owned by the office of the incumbent, and they are managed by the PCC. Now, in our diocese, we have some fantastic gems of Grade 1 buildings. We have Jarrow St. Paul's. It was mentioned by Councillor Atkinson to come to Arbea Fort. If you're doing that, come along to Jarrow St. Paul's. Drop in it. See what groundworks are doing at Jarrow Hall. It used to be Beadsworld. Sounds like a theme park where you can dress up like St. Bede. It's brilliant. But they actually own some of the most important, earliest examples of glass, stained glass, and stone, which is on the in the National Corpus. We have the Sister Monastic Church, St. Peter's in Monk Wearmouth. If you're going to the tall ships, go to St. Hilda's. I mean, it's like a beacon there on the headland, and all of these are buildings of international significance, architectural, historical, archaeological. But they're not all listed, and we have a large number of buildings which aren't, but they all form part of our built heritage. But none of them are heritage museums. They are all lived in and worked in. They are places of worship, serving their communities, and you have very hard people making them run on very stretched resources. And how do parishes meet this commitment to reach zero carbon? How do they manage their very limited resources, and the people, many of whom are elderly and are volunteers and doing their best but may not have the skill sets. We lack, I think, as an organisation, the resources and the people who can tell us, how do you get to where you need to be? It'd be fine for me to say to Kate Borden, my colleague Martin Howard, the Buildings Commission Secretary, say, look, Kate, you would like a boiler for your church? No, you can't have a gas boiler. You must go through a rigorous process to justify having a replacement gas boiler. And they pay £3,000 to a heating consultant or engineer, and they say, please put in a gas boiler. I'd be very interested to take away, I've got 1 minute left. I'll be very interested to take away from others how we can share best practice and knowledge. I can talk a bit about the problems which churches face, but what we've been doing is working with Durham University, and my colleague Ranjith Rosa and has been doing brilliant work to look at how we can form. We did some research on 3 churches and Durham Cathedral, which involved specific data modelling, simulation to see how they could decarbonise their church heating. And what came out of that study was that there isn't any software, they're on programs, things like SBEM calcs, which are used in the building regs Part L and in BREEAM. They don't have the data sets, they don't have the occupational profiles which are suitable for churches and I guess for other heritage buildings. And they provided Durham University in their research, they looked at 3 buildings and they rewrote, they did simulation, they did modelling, and they rewrote data which would allow for an accurate understanding of how a church building can decarbonise. But how do we apply that across 265 churches? And the cost of doing so is prohibitive. So I'm very pleased to be here and to answer any questions, and we'll see where we go. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming from a very, very different perspective here. I'm an independent creative producer and I work on multiple projects. So my work is project to project. I deliver outdoor festivals and events, and what this means is that I'm faced with a number of different aims and objectives from different organisations or projects that I'm working for. Those which are all about sustainability. So I was a producer for Festival of Thrift for a number of years, which is the National Festival of Sustainability, which looked at sustainability across its programming, across its delivery mechanisms and all of that kind of thing. I've worked on projects which look more about raising awareness with audiences and engaging them in climate crisis challenges. I've worked with projects that have sustainability high up in the agenda, like the tall ships, as Gemma was mentioning earlier. And now we're seeing it higher up in the agenda for funders as well, and having to respond to that in our funding applications for various projects. So because of the way that I work is and how it's so varied, I learn something new with everything I do. So I just thought I'd touch on some of the things that I've kind of come across through my work, and then how I've taken my approach as an independent forward. So with Festival of Thrift, for example, as I said, the focus is really on the festival being sustainable across the board. So there's a focus on engaging audiences and doing that in a way that is not challenging, which is about how we can engage people without bashing them over the head and making them feel bad for not doing certain things. So we would do things like take the UN sustainability goals and draw that down into a theme, which was quite easy for people to understand. So water, for example, was one of our themes, clean air 1 year, energy another year. And from that, we would programme in different ways. My role was really about programming, and I worked alongside other elements of the festival. So, for example, last year we commissioned a disco ball made up of entirely compact discs, which was playing pop music. Simple as that, alongside talks about bamboo as a sustainable building model, and Extinction Rebellion demonstrations on the site. And it was about not trying to do it all, but trying to find ways to spread the message of sustainability and get people involved in bite-sized ways. In addition to that, we developed a green rider for artists, which was about how artists could work with us to meet our goals as a festival of sustainability. So things like not bringing single-use plastics with them. We would provide water points and tea and coffee, but please bring your cups and your bottles. We had a deposit scheme for traders, which was about ensuring that they were taking away waste, that they weren't using single plastics themselves in their sales, and things like reporting to Julie's Bicycle to measure impact of the festival across the board. With tall ships, we've got a sustainability officer who helps us keep on the straight and narrow. So he sits in meetings with us. He prods us about various bits of programming that we're doing to make sure that we're not programming things that are unnecessarily non-sustainable, if you see what I mean. There's policies that we follow. And again, we're programming in line with the tall ships being the greenest tall ships that there's ever been. So we've commissioned things like Castaway, which is an aerial show about rubbish in waterways, so kind of mixing the two, water projects and climate change, as well as working with our artists and setting briefs that are about how they can deliver sustainability and to consider that in anything that they're delivering. With Hadrian's Wall, we didn't have a particularly sustainable message as part of the festival, but it was a priority for our delivery method. So for Apertura, for example, which Bill talked about earlier, that was completely low tech, and we recycled every piece of the project at the end of it. And in December, we delivered a project entirely off battery operated PAs and lighting that toured 10 different outdoor venues across the wall, and there were no generators on site. It was entirely chargeable battery operators. In addition to that, we had lots of considerations about the way that we delivered projects in terms of accessibility to sites, making sure that people weren't having to drive long distances or had the option to take public transport to visit things, and focusing on the hyperlocal and encouraging communities to develop things in their own areas. So as I said, I'm independent, and the way that I look to take sustainability on myself is taking bits of learning from lots of different projects and implementing what I can in the way that I go forward. So for example, the green rider that we developed for Thrift is something that I will take to Artists for Tall Ships, and so on. And I'm not an expert. I don't think anyone is, and I feel like it needs to be a collective effort. So that's another thing to kind of push the message through everyone that I'm working with.
So I don't want to use this one. Taped together. Don't worry.
So I've been asked just to say something from the funder perspective, and probably I'll say something in Sarah's absence for the nature sector perspective as well. So the funder's been dealing with environmental sustainability for a few years now. Some of you might have noticed the one question that was added to the application form to ask people to achieve some sustainability, some environmental sustainability. The reason that we do that is because we are the largest funder, so we kind of need to make sure that the projects that we're funding don't have negative environmental impacts and hopefully promote positive environmental impacts. I think from what we see with the new strategy, where sustainability is one of the 4 key pillars now, they're the 4 investment principles, there will be a greater emphasis on this, and not just, I suppose, creating positive impacts as opposed to just not doing any more negative. I think there will be a shift towards that. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. One of the things in my engagement role, just to say as well, we use the sustainability goals from the UN just to try and explain to people from grant sizes for kind of £3,000 right the way to 5 million, just to say, these are the kinds of things, you can't do everything, break it down what is achievable. So we've kind of been using that as an engagement message, which I imagine will still continue. And internally as an organisation, we use those goals. We've kind of set up plans for that kind of in each of our teams. And lastly, I would just say that I was at the North East Nature Leaders Forum yesterday. They're having exactly the same discussion about carbon net zero, how they can do things. And they had a wonderful talk from Jess, who is from the North of Tyne Combined Authority Net Zero Northern England. And there's just some synergies here with adding up the partnerships. But the nice thing that she did say is that the Northeast is a leader in this, in reaching net zero and carbon, and actually have been on the front foot in thinking about this when other places aren't. So it was really nice to hear. And obviously the nature sector are interested in that, but it's going to affect the whole heritage sector.
Thanks, Jody. And we did have a pre-meet with Sarah, and from the landscape perspective, in her role specifically, she said one of the things they're struggling with is just a lack of resource within the organization in terms of having the expertise to actually deal with this. Like, the directive has come down, net zero, meet these targets, but everyone's like, how? Like, we don't know where to go. We don't know where the resources are. And one of the things, Dan had been talking about is there assessment software that's going to help us look at our buildings and understand how to even begin to capture how to deal with that. And in that conversation with the four of us, what came out was this really interesting thing about how in many organizations, it's nobody's responsibility yet. Gemma's really lucky because she has someone who's a sustainability lead who can, help keep your team on track and help keep everyone focused on that. But in many organizations who have this imperative now, it's nobody's responsibility yet, but yet it's everybody's responsibility in every part of our jobs. To be helping our organizations in a 360 way reach towards, net zero targets and more sustainable operations. So, I'm beginning to feel like there's this piece around, about how do we embed that into all of our organizations, that culture of it's everybody's jobs. Similar to fundraising, you don't sit in any size or shape of an organization and feel like that's just somebody else's job. You know that it's about you and how you operate as well to help your organization be financially sustainable. So now that's also about environmentally sustainable. And certainly when you think about the landscape perspective, the sheer amount of land that has to go into mitigation every year in order for us to meet net zero targets is equivalent to 1.5 HS2s. Think about that per year. And that's in either coastal mitigation, peatland reclamation, things like reforestation. So if you're the National Trust or the AONB or the RSPB or any major landowner, you've been given the task to make sure that you're working towards that you're getting your mitigation done, but you're not necessarily being handheld through the process or helped with the expense of it. And every year that those targets aren't met, it gets tacked on to the next year. So this is a huge challenge, especially in a place like the Northeast, where there's so much land that hasn't yet had the sort of quantification process on the historic environment done yet. So there is quite a lot of work to be done, and it is on everybody's minds. I really love that shift towards creating positive impacts rather than just not doing harm. I love the idea of a green rider. I love the idea of the proactivity and the sort of inventory of historic buildings. I think that's all really, really interesting and certainly food for thought. But now it's time to open it up to the floor and to hear some responses. I'm really would love to hear from everyone in the audience, what would be most helpful to you as practitioners to take the next step towards net zero targets or sustainability. Whatever thoughts you have are welcome to the panel.
Hi, it's a question for Jody, really. Your one question on sustainability, what weighting does that carry then when you make decisions on funding? I mean, would you turn a project down because it wasn't sustainable? Because I kind of feel that in public policy generally, money makes things move much more quickly. And, perhaps if Heritage Lottery Fund was, what are they called? National Lottery Heritage Fund, we're saying, we will not fund this unless you can demonstrate how it's sustainable, but also encourages applicants to put in, the costs of that, accessing that expertise or supporting the work that needs to happen to do that. Then that might actually drive things forward very quickly. As as the biggest funder in the sector, as you say, perhaps there is a greater responsibility here to turn down projects that don't do the right thing and fund projects that do.
Yeah, because we're in that bit between strategies, I suppose it's quite interesting. We have, for the last framework, the last kind of 5-year framework, encourage people to include costs We know this costs, and we don't want people to be shortchanged by that. The one question has been described as, this is the way that we use language. It's not described as mandatory, like a mandatory outcome or other things that are mandatory. It's described as a requirement, which is really, don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but technically, yes, we would be able to say no to a project because they haven't even attempted to do something, or that we believe that it's not sufficient enough. So we could use that as a reason for rejecting a project, or saying, I really like your project, but this area was weak, so we'd really like you to consider it and come back to us, or something like that. So yeah, we can at this moment in time do that. And I think as we change towards those 4 principles, as far as I understand it, when the new business plan comes out, there'll be more detail. As far as I understand it, projects would need to be doing something across those 4 principles. So the weighting could entirely be potentially on sustainability and resilience and away from inclusion. Other projects might be weighted more towards inclusion. So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out in decision making, to be quite honest, but yeah, it is there. And I should say as well, we can include costs for joining the Fit for the Future network, which is one of the methods that we've used to encourage organisations to think about sustainability as well. So yeah, costs should be in there.
Thank you. Sorry, could I ask a follow-up question on that? In how far are funders aware of the difficulties, for example, a complex heritage building has in even getting to the point to decide which of the measures to take? So before I'm even ready to do a pre-application to the lottery, I would have spent an arm and a leg to find out which of the various measures I can actually implement in a Grade 1 listed building. So I think we've been lobbying the Church of England as well to really think about giving funding opportunities very early on to get professional advice. And I just wonder, is that something on the cards? Is that thought about?
I think that's something, I think that's something for us as a funder to take into consideration. We, as I say, there was loads of resources on the slide that I did. There's all of these resources, but that doesn't necessarily mean that someone's helped to navigate that point. And because it's one of our 4 principles, we're thinking of ways in which we might be able to help address that. So one of those things might be taking on professional support and workshops with particular sectors or something like that, so that we can try and unlock, because we've got quite a lot of money to dish out, I'll be honest, but we can't fund every single organisation to do all of those resources. We need to draw on the fact that the diocese have looked at buildings specifically. We need to learn from that so that we can then maybe fund the next bit or like parts of it. So we need to think of cleverer ways of working with the amount of money that we have.
Does anyone from Historic England maybe want to comment?
Oh, it doesn't stretch.
Hi, thank you. Historic England has, you may be probably aware, has some useful advice on our website. We are working on more and better advice. We know it's the defining issue of our era, and we need to be part of enabling people who own or manage, your example, Grade 1 listed buildings, but listed buildings and designated heritage assets to get to grips with this. The work has started, it's certainly not complete. I'd be happy to catch up with you afterwards and take your example down. If you have an example of a specific problem with accessing info, then I'd be happy to take that down and get that to the relevant people within HE.
I just wanted to add that after our early conversation, I did some research. Has anyone here, hands up, heard of the Carbon Literacy Project? Great. So the Carbon Literacy Project has toolkits for almost every situation to begin to understand your responsibilities and how to achieve better understanding of how to deal with the sort of net zero targets and how to decarbonize and understand that situation. So I would encourage all of you to look at it. And I think what John might have just been talking about is, I know that within Historic England, someone has been tasked with adapting the carbon literacy project toolkits into something that's fit for purpose for the heritage sector across landscapes and historic buildings. So definitely connect, but also stay tuned. That work is underway.
It was a comment rather than a question, actually, for that lady and the response from Historic England. I know that Dan sends out the most amazing amount of resources, but usually his emails are attached by about 54 long documents that I don't have enough hours in the day to read, and trying to find stuff through that is, I know the information's there, but actually finding it in a time scale that matters to me is really hard. One of the things that we learned over COVID is how many hours we can sit in Zoom, which, you know, most of us don't want to go back to. But there is also an accessibility thing about learning styles and actually having a way that specific issues, maybe not too specific, but specific areas of issues could be logged so that people who did have more current understanding of all the resources that are there could actually begin to record 5-minute little, if this is your issue, this is the best place you need for the information, not with all due respect, because I love him sending me 54 documents that some of which say the same thing and I can't find. And actually, there is a lot of information on a lot of those websites, but actually building up a library of people being able to say, if this is what you're trying to do, here is the top sort of 2 or 3 things you might want to start with, and then have those links as things to go afterwards. That would be, for people that are kind of time poor, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Gemma.
Sorry, I'll get you next. Sure, I'm just cautious of my face, and that way people might not. It's just for the legal. Sorry, I don't pass the mic to that lady.
Oh, hi, I just wanted to comment on the back of that comment. I'm the lady with the white board outside talking about resilience from the Heritage Alliance point of view. But I'm also here in a separate hat as well, because I do Secretariat support for the National Historic Environment Forum. And the forum's been running on a task and finish group model for a few years, and one of the most recent task and finish projects, if you will, that they've launched in November last year was something called the Heritage Sector Net Zero Resource Page. And on that page we have a long and short list of resources for the sector addressing kind of net zero and carbon related questions, and it is looking to kind of demystify some of it, which it's not clips which you were talking about, but it is a kind of long list trying to categorise things in a way that makes sense. And I think it is the first time all of that material has been brought together for a heritage sector point of view. There also is something on there called the HEF Net Zero Guide, which is a 5-step guide for small and medium organisations to help them to start to assess their carbon footprint and take steps to reduce it on a kind of scalable level. So I hope that might be something that's useful in that context, but something that we are hoping to build on.
Probably a bit of a reflection, but I'd appreciate the panel's views. As I mentioned earlier, I'm fortunate for a reasonable kind of wide view of the world, and I think one of the things is we've been working through tall ships, but equally some of our work in communities and some of our hardest reach communities, especially as we're seeing them face a real crisis around energy, is the discussion and actually even the terminology of sustainability and carbon neutral, as we've tested it with some focus groups of some of our most challenging communities, some of those living in crisis, some of those that are illiterate. They don't know what that means. The most common kind of term that people do actually understand is recycling, but actually the ability to manage recycling whilst living in crisis is difficult. I suppose the point I'm trying to make is I think this topic is vast, and I think one of the things we found out, and hopefully was a little bit reflective in the presentation, is who is our audience? And whoever our audience is, we have to approach this topic in a very different way. And I think we're quite fortunate in this room to probably have a level of professional context and understanding, and even we're finding it quite difficult. So I think as we pass that burden, and one of the things we've had to appreciate with tall ships is, if we pass the burden to businesses involved in this, what is the impact on them, even though they appreciate why they need to do it? in turn then passing that burden to the communities that will be visiting us and trying to appreciate what will that mean to them. So I think there's a lot in this, and I think there's a way of us trying to interpret it, think a bit about our audiences. There's a very professional context to this, but there's also very much a community context to this. We know how important it is, but I think that ability to actually apply it and make the change that we need is still quite far away. And I think just a final point is how integrated, and it's two elements within our policy. Our policy is on the Tall Ships website. We're trying to use that as a bit of a start for 10 so we can evaluate that, see how it goes. But that kind of access and inclusion is a key part of it, as well as diversity, and all of these things are so interlinked. We need to think about how we don't look at something in isolation.
Nice reminder. I was just going to say the presentation that the Net Zero Northern England lady from the Combined Authority delivered yesterday, she was showing the path that the North East had taken in the last 5 years. And what I found really interesting, or challenged my perception, was domestic sector, stayed the same pretty much, tiny little fluctuations. Our kinds of sector where we would have fit in that map, heritage-wise, had tiny little fluctuations within it, but pretty much stayed the same. Industry is where we need to learn from, because they've managed to communicate to themselves and sort themselves out, and their emissions dramatically dropped in the graph. Same for transport. They had little kind of went, and then obviously someone had a good idea because there was a dip in the graph where they made it much better, but everything else was pretty much the same. So I think there's ways to learn from, and because of that industry drop, that's why we were looking as though as a region we will meet our net zero target. But just something to reflect on. How do they communicate it? Because the domestic, I'm recycling at home, but I've used nappies. Do you know what I mean? It's not myself, on the kids. And it's just how do you communicate those messages so it gets through to our sector, through to everyday usage?
That's a really good point. And as part of the research for this session, I was learning all about how massive developers and other businesses like Costain, who are doing quite a bit of work on HS2, are now moving towards using different kinds of machinery, electric machinery, and there's targets around, how they're going to decarbonize the work that they're doing, which aren't filtering through. You're right. So that's definitely something for us to all think about and follow up on. Stay tuned. Is there a hand up in the back? Yes, green sweater.
It's just a few thoughts, I suppose, really. One is, I think, possibly with a little bit of leadership around this within the region. I think there's loads of great work going on, and we've heard about some of that today. And you see there's an overwhelming number of toolkits and advice and the rest of it. But it's kind of, well, what are our priorities for this? How can the culture sector have a kind of unified voice? And is that possible? There's challenges, some people local authority led, and will have different aims and objectives and pressures on them as well. I agree with what Keith was saying. I think if it is the sector itself who is having to kind of monitor itself and its progress in this area, it's always easier to be guided by cost than it is by the right thing to do. And making the right choice in terms of environmental issues often costs more money. It costs more to go onto the greener electric tariffs. And for organisations struggling, that is a difficult decision to make. And I'm just wondering where the kind of unified voices for either the culture sector or museums, for example, as well, because I think it could do with just a bit more coordination, I think, because lots of people are doing great stuff, but what are we actually achieving? I think, Jodie, you just pointed out there, actually, it's minimal gains, I think, and the kind of ramped up the emphasis on it now, but this isn't new. This is kind of over 30 years out of date almost, and I think the emphasis is just coming now, and I think we really need to kind of either decide this is important to us and therefore we're going to do something collectively about it, or we will continue, I think, probably in the same vein as we're working in at the minute.
I just wanted to add to that to say it'd be great if there was one place where organisations in the sector and groups could post sort of good practice and do things, whether that's the NECP or not, because I was at the Net Zero Northumberland event in Stannington a little while back, and you see different. It's not just from looking how industry can teach other sectors. It's seeing in your sector you've got in different geographical locations, you've got people hitting their heads on brick walls, the very similar brick walls, just in different locations. And I think talking about that, whether it's how to get PV and storage, battery storage systems into heritage buildings, and people are facing the same challenges. And I think people don't even know these events are taking place or what then comes from those events, and having some way of channeling that would be very helpful, I think. Yeah.
Matthew.
Thank you. Just two things. On the topic of how do we find out, one of the priorities for the rest of the Case for Culture, I mentioned, is the Green Investment Fund, and that covers the whole process from the thinking about the priorities, the liaising with partners who can support that, and then getting the funds that will enable that to be addressed. So that's a key part of the plan. On another thing, I think I've just found a way to get rid of consultants. And so I just, while I was sitting here, I wasn't doing my mail. I just thought, what does ChatGPT tell me about this? And I asked ChatGPT to come up with a how to achieve net zero for historic buildings. Wow. Great. I've got this. I'll email it.
But, you know that's what Historic England is doing in the back office right now.
Yeah, but that point about not being overwhelmed by it, because there are developments and tools that can help us. And if I had a small local community museum, I may not be able to find my way to navigate through everything, but there really are good tools. And having read through it, yeah, that's absolutely good. So I think the thing about knowledge and how we use knowledge, I know it can be scary for people who are knowledge holders, but there are answers there that makes it very, very possible and not so scary, unless you're a consultant.
Sorry, just a follow-up, I guess comments rather than questions. We've talked a lot about the financial cost of making these environmental changes, but the other side of the flip is that, yes, it impacts your financial sustainability to be environmentally sustainable because of the cost of green electricity is more expensive. But you mentioned, people recognise recycling, but actually the step one of that is reducing. And for a lot of our heritage attractions and our visitor attractions, a large source of their income comes through secondary spend. So it's a double-edged sword. If you are living well environmentally, you're trying to reduce what people buy, you're trying to reduce the plastic little bits that every school child wants to take home. And that is going to have an impact on your bottom line as much as paying out for the environmental side. Even things like really digging into everyone moved to cotton tote bags, but actually the environmental impact of a cotton tote bag, to make it environmentally neutral, you need to use it about 400 plus times. For a paper bag, it's 4 times. For a plastic bag, it's actually lower than in a cotton tote bag once you take into account growing the cotton, processing it, manufacturing it, bleaching it, dyeing it. So it's a really complex situation. And I really, really feel for heritage organisations because they're being attacked, and the cultural sector, because they're being attacked on all sides with it. They need to bring more audiences in. That's going to have an impact on transport emissions. They want them to spend money. Paper cups are still not as great as using a mug. It's just, yeah. Sorry, that was a really depressing negative way to end it. Sucks. Sorry.
Yeah, I suppose coming back to my earlier point, and in answering Jodie's question about why is the industry's reducing its impact and we're not, it's because they're being financially incentivized to do so. So in order to win government procurement contracts, in order to win local authority procurement contracts, industry has to reduce its carbon footprint. If it doesn't reduce its carbon footprint, it's also being fined or punished to do that. So there's a really clear financial incentive to do that. So again, I would come back to the fact that the funders in the room need to be really clear about that this work needs to be funded. We need to be incentivized to do it and supported to do it. And then just a second thing, if I can, just a slightly more positive thing, is that, come back to the question of leadership and around museums, that we recently, as Tyne & Weir, Archives and Museums, brought together a number of the museums, archives, collecting institutions in the region. We've talked a lot about buildings, we haven't talked about collections. And actually looking after heritage collections has a massive impact on the environment, and heritage collections are being massively impacted on the environment. And there's this kind of vicious circle around the more you do to try and control the environment, you're actually using more and more energy, which is having a massive impact then on the environment. So we recently brought a number of museums and archives together to start thinking about this, and with museum development, Northeast in the room to also support smaller museums who might be doing that. So we're hoping to develop a kind of framework around some of the big issues around collections going forward, and we'll obviously be working with NECP to encourage, to get that news out there and encourage people to get involved in that, if and when our bid to National Literary Heritage Fund is successful.
Just to respond on the funding thing that I was thinking about this morning, when you apply for Arts Council funding at the minute, there's an option to request additional funding for personal access, which is about engaging people with access needs in the projects that you deliver. And that money that you can request is above and beyond the level of a grant that you apply for. And now one of the key investment principles for Arts Council is about its environmental responsibility, but that isn't something that is extra that you can request. And what that does for a project the types of project that I work on means that you're having to reduce perhaps the creative output in order to use more sustainable methods of delivery. I don't know if anyone from Arts Council's here, but that's just something that I was thinking about.
I think that's exactly what I was trying to get at, really, was that you could have that as additional, so it becomes something extra that's added on to the cost of the project. I should say I wasn't complaining about the fact that you had that one question in your application form, because I don't think I think it's exactly right. It's just the weight that needs to be given in that.
I think that whole point about additionality is really important, because if there are core things that we as a sector have to do, as humanity has to do, it's not really additionality anymore. Social impact, working with your audiences, decarbonizing, all of this stuff has to be built in. I know. So I think we're gonna wrap up now. A few really quick reflections. I've heard a lot about challenge. Challenge has been mentioned. The challenges have started out almost every session, but I've also heard a lot of solutionizing and a lot of partnerships come, the word partnership and new and different kinds of partnerships, and innovating the way we work is also a theme. Probably partly motivated by the post-pandemic landscape we're all working in now, but also new financial realities. And I think that slide that Gemma put up at the end of what she's facing with the tall ships is broadly applicable to how we all feel about our work life and how things are changing for all of us right now. I also wanted to mention that the Northeast Culture Partnership will be sending out an evaluation tomorrow via Eventbrite. It will really help us to plan future events and make the case to funders to help us do more of these types of events. So please look out for that email and spend 5 minutes giving us your feedback. And I think the final point around, where is the leadership? Where is that unified place where we can all come and look, provides a real imperative for doing events like this. So we can all come together and at least continue to share these things, share resources. I didn't know about some of the things we'd heard about in the session today, and I did do a bunch of research before I came here. So I think that's really important. No, I'm just joking. So thanks all. This brings the close of our formal session. So thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to Northeast Culture Partnership for hosting this event, and to the NLHF and Historic England for funding it. And all the staff at the Customs House for ensuring that everything ran smoothly this afternoon. So thanks all for coming.